Good morning, everyone. I would like to welcome you to this seminar presentation by Dr. Saralis Nadaraja and Martin Weigand, both from the Manchester University, UK. The title of their presentation is The Drastic Under-Representation of African Researchers in Africa, related research. Actually, Dr. Nadaraja is a former student of this university. He did his BSc 1987 to 1990. It was honors in statistics or
honors in mathematics.
Yeah, honors in mathematics.
Yeah.
Currently, he is teaching our master's students, and his research focus is on distribution theory, extreme value theory, financial mathematics, and actuarial science. Then the other presenter, Martin Weigand, of course, this is his first time in Africa. Okay. He did his BSc in mathematics 2011 to 2014 from University of Heidelberg, Germany. He did his MSc in mathematics from the same institution 2014 to 2016 to 2016 years. He currently is doing his PhD, and the good thing, Dr. Nadaraja is his supervisor. He started his PhD 2016. He's looking forward to finish his PhD this year, 2019. Okay, and his research focus is on distribution theory, non-parametric statistics, and computational statistics. On computational statistics, I'm sure most of you are aware that he's taking you through R, isn't it? I'm sure most of you are attending the lectures 4 to 6, isn't it? Okay. So I welcome you. Okay. I give the floor to you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. Hello. How are you guys? All right. I did, as Evan said, I did my BSc at this university long time ago. I mean, my first lecture was held in this room. I can't remember who the lecturer was, but I was sitting somewhere over there. I can't remember where I was sitting. Martin and I, as Ivan said, currently based at the University of Manchester in England. And I come to Africa, or Zimbabwe nearly. I've been here many times. I mean, the last few years I've been coming to Zimbabwe every year. And I'm really passionate about the African continent and the science in the African continent. I feel the African continent is being ripped off in many ways, not with respect to minerals, but also in several other ways. And in this talk with Martin, my colleague, I want to talk about one way that the African continent is being ripped off. And this is reflected in the title, The Drastic Underrepresentation of African Researchers in African-Related Research. Right? So basically it says that much of the research being done on issues affecting Africa are being done by non-Africans, that is, people from outside the continent are doing most of the research. with little or no input sought from scientists in Africa, right? Okay. Right. So this is the overview of our talk. The motivation for the talk. I will talk about the motivation and the data for the talk, and Martin, my colleague, will talk about methods, findings, comparisons of the talk, and the final two sections, conclusions and discussion, I will talk about, right? So let me start with the motivation. As you know, Africa is full of rich resources. It has all the minerals in the world, right? Like for example, Botswana has 20% of the diamond in the world, and DRC is very rich in minerals, and nearly every country that is shaded in a color here, right, has so much resources, right? But unfortunately, these resources are being ripped off, stolen by the West. When I say West, I mean the Europe, America, and other parts of the world, right? They are being stolen. They are being used to make things like the iPhone, right? Things like the iPhone, things like the laptops, things like the cell phone, and so on. And they're making profits in trillions of dollars. And the West is getting richer and richer and richer, whereas the people in the continent get poorer and poorer and poorer. Right? Okay? So this is one way that Africa is being ripped off, right? Another way is publications. There are various publications by authors outside the continent. This is one of them, which is most shocking. It says, I don't know if they can read it, it says that the level of IQ, remember IQ is a score that used to measure intelligence, right? The level of IQ of Africans is about 70, and that's at the borderline of, I don't know whether I can use it, I'm totally ashamed to use this word. The level of IQ of Africans is in the borderline of mental retardation. I mean, this is a paper published by scientists outside the continent, and that they get recognized for publishing papers like this, right? Yeah. I mean, how can they say such a thing? I mean, how can they say such a thing like this, right? Africa has so many brilliant people, right? I mean, the president of the U.S. came from Africa. There are so many Olympic champions from Africa. There are so many Nobel Prize winners from Africa. So how could that be that the IQ level is so? How could somebody in the West claim that the IQ level of Africans is in the borderline of mental retardation? It's the most outrageous thing to say, right? Another one, this is, you might have read this in the news. This is Ronald Reagan, he's the former president of the United States. He claims that the African delegates at the United Nations are monkeys. I'm sorry to use the word again. I mean, this guy is the president of the United States, a former president, using that word to describe the delegates at the African delegates at the United Nations. It's most outrageous. Yeah. Another one. These are books. These two here are books written by people in the West. The first book is called Oral Literature in Africa. The second one is called War and Famine in Africa. And the authors of both books have no affiliation to Africa. They are both written by people outside Africa. I mean, how could they know everything? How could they know everything that happens in Africa without being in Africa, or without having traveled to Africa, right? And there's also one more paper about groundwater security and drought in Africa. Once again, the authors of this paper have no affiliation to Africa, and yet they write about subjects related to Africa, right? Without claiming to have all the knowledge of the subject, right? But probably never been to this continent. I mean, probably never been to this continent. And this is commonplace, as Martin will explain later in the talk. He will tell you that most of the papers published about Africa have no authors from Africa, right? And he will explain later in the talk, but I will just give you the motivation, right? This is two more papers. The first one is on AIDS in Africa, and the second one is about vegetation of Africa. Once again, the authors have no affiliations to institutes in Africa, and yet they write about these subjects clearly related to Africa, right? Okay, so these are just two examples of papers being written by researchers outside of the continent, claiming to know everything that is happening in the continent, right? All right, so what can we do, right? From the fact is, as I said already, there are so few researchers in Africa whose names are put in these papers. So how can we determine the frequency of these publications, right? Or how can we determine the frequency of publications with no African authors, right? And can we determine the distribution or the frequency of papers with no African authors through factors such as the field of research, like for example biology or mathematics or engineering, or the location. When I say location, I mean the country. It could be Zimbabwe, Zambia, Angola, etc. Or the specific journal. Like in certain journals there could be more African authors, and in certain other journals there could be less African authors, and so on. So can we determine the dependency of having little African authors in the papers to these various factors, right? And the last question is that can we explain this phenomena? That is, the phenomena is that there are very few publications with African authors, right? By the publication data alone. That's the last question. Now to answer these questions, Martin and I decided to use certain databases. I'm sure you know, there are databases that actually give you the name of the publication, the authors of the publication, the name of the journal, the year of the publication, the month of the publication, and so on. And some of these databases, there's one called Scopus, you might have heard about. There's another one called ISI, Web of Knowledge, right? And so on. I mean, Scopus is the most popular one. So we decided to use Scopus to extract the data on the things I talked about. That is the year of the publication, the name of the authors, the location of the authors, the title of the paper, the journal of the paper, and so on, right? Okay, so we decided to use Scopus. The Scopus it has data going back to 1900 to the current day. So sometimes even before 1900, sometimes before 1800 to the current day. So the variables that Scopus gives are the following. The main variables, the primary variables that we were interested in were the author, name of the authors, the title of the paper, the address of the authors, that is where they are from, okay, abstract, and the author keywords and the index keywords. And the secondary variables we were interested in were the title of the paper, the volume of the paper, the citation count. Citation is basically how many times the paper has been cited by other researchers. Okay. So those are some secondary variables that we were interested in. So we can use this data to analyze, we can use this data to see if our hypothesis that very few researchers are being put in the papers relating to Africa is true or not, right? So the thing is, there are 2 points here. So the principal idea is to identify how many of the papers are impacted by knowledge and experience of local in Africa, right? How many of these papers being published require knowledge about about Africa? The second thing is, do the authors, or at least one of the authors, have such a knowledge to write such papers, right? So if you look at this diagram here, you have this on the left-hand side. On the left-hand side, you have the investigators, right? And in the middle, you have a committee of African experts, right? And there are 2 possible outcomes. One outcome will say that the subject being written by the investigators about Africa is the correct one, and they have the knowledge. They have the correct knowledge to write that paper. And the second outcome is the opposite of that. It says that the investigators don't have the knowledge, don't have sufficient knowledge, right, to write a paper about Africa, right, about the subject in Africa, right? All right, so this diagram here, it pretty much tells you, right? Then the data overview. This is the overview of the data. You can see there are 350,000. That's about quarter of a million, right? Is that right? Yeah, sorry, third of a million. A third of a million papers written about Africa. Okay, there are a third of a million papers, and some of these papers date back to 1960 up until the current year, right? And these papers are being published in over 20,000 journals, conferences, and other means. And these papers involve authors from over 200 countries around the world, right? And the topics of research in this paper concern 40 plus countries, 40 plus African countries. As Martin will explain in a minute, unfortunately, out of the 350,000 papers relating to Africa, very few of these papers have African authors, or very few of these papers have authors from Africa, based in Africa, right? So Martin will talk about it in a minute. So, all right, so let me stop here and give the place to Martin. As you can see, before I give to Martin, let me say that 350,000 papers is an awful lot, I mean, it's an awful lot of papers, right? I mean, in the West, in order to get promotion to full professor, you only need there are two journals. One is called Science, another one is called Nature. The Science and Nature are considered to be the most popular. They're considered to be the most popular journals, right? And if you can publish 3 papers, not 350,000, if you can publish 3 papers in Science or Nature, then you're most likely to become a full professor. That's in the West, right? Okay. So what publishing so many papers, 350,000 with so few authors from Africa is a record. So Martin will explain in a minute how it's being done. Okay.
Thank you very much, Sarah-Lise. First of all, I would like to thank everybody for turning up in such large numbers. And since it's my first time in Africa, I would also like to thank the people for the warm welcome I've received here. And I hope you find this talk interesting, and I hope it motivates you to get involved in academia, to pick up a career in science, and to correct those wrongs. Optimally, we would have a review panel of African authors, several academics from Africa. We could ask for each publication, number of people. Do you agree? Are the authors, with their qualifications and their background, are they able to adequately write this paper on the topic located, tied to Africa? And then we could decide, do we have the qualified background or not? But obviously, for 350,000 titles, that is hard to do. So we have to resort to a proxy method. We have to approximate this method. We've done so by getting the publication data from the internet, the raw data, and checking for the relevance to the continent of Africa. We've done so by checking the title for any variation of Africa, so Afrikaans, Afrikaan, any country located in Africa, either current or former since the 1960s. We've taken that as an indicator of the publication being focused on an African topic, heavily tied to the continent. So by this, we get a selection of papers. Those were the 350,000 titles. Those are only the titles related to Africa by our criteria. So we get the title, the authors, and the affiliation. So those are our main identifiers. Those are the primary variables we're looking at. Then we are checking in the title. Do we have this specific relation to Africa? As I said, we're checking for the country names, making sure it's being mentioned, but we're also checking for false positives. So obviously, if we're checking for Africa, but we have African Americans in the title, well, that is a match, but it's not relevant for us. So same as Papua New Guinea. So if we're looking for Guinea or Equatorial Guinea, we're going to get another false positive. So we filtered out all those false positives to make sure we're only focused on Africa-related publications. So once we get a positive hit, then we can continue to check. Again, we need to go to a proxy. We can't check, has the author been traveling to Africa? How closely is he tied to the continent? Does he have colleagues he very, very closely collaborates with? So we've resorted to the affiliation. So checking at which university is this person working. Is the university in Africa or not? And then we investigate this affiliation for all the authors of every publication. Because our opinion is that if a person is closely collaborating with African researchers, why would there not be at least a co-author? Why would there be 0 Africans in this paper? So when we're talking about African affiliation, we had to specify that a little bit, because obviously it's a huge continent with vastly different economic situations, cultural differences. So we have excluded the Northern African states and also South Africa for the time being, because South Africa, as you all know, they do have different academic systems, they do have different economic circumstances. So they behave a little bit different as the rest of Africa. So, the countries in green are the ones we have considered as African in our research. Well, all the grey countries, they might disagree with that classification, but that's what it is for now. So, then we get our filter data. We do have still the publication title, the journal it's appeared in, the journal ranking. So we have used the H factor. For those of you who are not familiar with the H factor, if you have an H factor of, let's say, 100, that means you have at least 100 publications that have been cited 100 times. So that means for Nature, they have over 1,000 publications that have been cited at least 1,000 times. So that is one of the quality measures for journals. So the higher your H factor, the more impactful the journal is. Then we have binary arguments of affiliation in Africa. That just means, is there at least one person, one author in this paper affiliated with Africa at the time? Then we have a bit more granular measurement of the percentage of African authors. Again, we're saying African authors, which is short for Africa-affiliated authors, because we're talking about the people who are currently at the research institution in Africa. So that's just percentage. So if you have 5 authors for the paper and only one person is affiliated with Africa, you'd have a 0.2 percentage. That gives some indication of if there's participation of African authors, how large is this participation? So from the journals and the rankings, as Sally said, we have our primary variables of the affiliation, of the title, and then we move on to disseminate how is that connected with the journals, the journal rankings, economic factors in the countries. How does that look like for different countries? If we move from, say, Zimbabwe to Zambia, do we get similar numbers if we move on to Botswana? If we look at the researchers per capita, how does that influence our numbers per each country? So first off, we're just looking at the accumulated percentages. So number on the far right, we're looking at the frequency of publications that have a specific percentage. And that's the result we get. So in gray are all the publications that have no African author, no Africa-affiliated author, not a single one. On the far right, that's only African authors. And the light green in the middle, those are all the different shades in between. Going from just 10% authors, so maybe 1 in 10, going on to half, and over to all African. So as we can see, the collaboration between Africans and non-Africans is almost non-existent. So and that in itself, that is a painful reality. See that. If we accumulate all those numbers, get a little pie chart here. So in gray again, those are all the publications without any African authors attached. So more than half of the publications on Africa feature no African. Less than 1/4 contain only African authors, and only around 1/4 is a collaboration to varying degrees. So that's just an overview of the different percentages in all the publications out of the 350,000. So now I want to move on to make some links between some of the observed factors. The first one's going to be the citation count. So how does the percentage of Africans in each paper affect citations? So is it more or less likely to be cited if there are fewer or more Africans on this paper? Normally you think if you have more local authors, you think, okay, these people are directly impacted, they live there where research is being conducted. You think, okay, that gives you more credibility. But if we look at this heat map, that's not the case. So each of those cells is a combination of a percentage or percentage range. So this one in the lower left corner, there would be 0 to 10% of authors are African in all these papers, and they're cited less than, I think that's 200 times. So it's just to gain an overview how the citation count correlates with the percentages of African authors attached. So as you can see, the most cited papers have no African authors. So the only ones with 2,000, like widely impactful publications, have no Africans attached to it. So, and you can see this triangular structure. So the more we increase the Africans on the paper, the more Africans we have writing the papers, the more research we have, the less citations we get. There you go. So if you accumulate those citation counts, that's the picture we're getting. So we've accumulated every citation from every paper with no Africans, done that for all the different percentages, up to the point where we have only African authors for publications and added all their citations. Those are the accumulated citations by percentage. And again, we're seeing a similar picture here. The paper is only containing African authors. They get cited to some degree, but the overwhelming majority is still on the non-African side. And that looks quite familiar to the first plot we had. So what that tells us is that even though that the publications are almost equally likely to be cited, so that means if we have a publication that's been written by only African authors, that is not wildly less, I think there's like a 20% difference, it's not wildly less likely to be cited than one that's been written by non-Africans. So that means it doesn't really seem to affect the perceived quality depending which percentage we have. So those seem to be very strongly correlated. So if we go and accumulate that by the journals, we get the following pictures. So those are the percentages, the average percentages for all publications accumulated by journal. So on the top left corner, that's Nature's publications. I have a little bit over 800 publications there. The outer ring, that is the percentage of publications that contain no African authors. So in gray, that is that number. So we have in Nature, 7% of all papers related to Africa have not a single African author. And only the remaining 30% have at least one. The inner circle, that's the percentage, the average percentage by paper. So if you pick out a random paper from Nature, it's written about Africa, we're going to have 20% African author affiliation there. Okay. And we have that for all the highest ranked journals here. So those were the 10 most the 10 journals with the highest H factor. We get Science. Science is similarly bad. We have 72% of all publications without any authors from Africa, and a 13.3% average per paper. And that moves on. We have even journals as bad as Journal of Clinical Investigation, where not a single one of the publications we investigated had an African author. None. And that's since the 1960s. So those are the top journals, the top 10. Luckily, there are journals that do a better job. So those are the 10 most frequent. We're doing something wrong here. Journals which explicitly focus on Africa. So they're centered around topics in Africa, like the East African Medical Journal, African Journal of Ecology, and so on. So they're much more specialized, and apparently they're more aware of the issue, because the percentages we have observed there, they're much more favorable. If you're looking at the East African Medical Journal, that is based in Kenya. So most of these are based in the UK or in the US. I think one of them in the Netherlands. But those two, they're based in Africa. So here we have very good values. If we observe, have more than 3/4 of the publications feature African authors, and the per paper average is much higher as well. So there do exist those journals which do a good job, but if you look at the rankings, they don't play in the top 10, do they? So if we have a look at the individual distribution by journals, so those are 3 different examples. On the x-axis, we have the percentage of African authors, and on the y-axis, the frequency. If we look at science, there's a huge bulk at the no African author percentage. Then we have almost no collaborative efforts, and then a small bump with only African authors. So again, that would be one of the examples that we're criticizing, saying that is not favoring collaboration, it's not encouraging it. Most of the publications are done only by people outside Africa with like small features of African authors attached. Similar with IEEE. They're doing a little bit of a better job because we have more collaboration in the middle. So if we're in the middle here, that's where we have collaborations. That's where we have mixed authorship. But again, overwhelmingly, only people outside Africa have written those publications. Malaria, for example, that's something that looks more like what we would expect, what we want to see. We have overwhelmingly collaborative efforts. People from within and outside Africa working together on those problems. So, and that is important because we want to make use of maybe funding, outside input, expertise from outside, but we need to have people from the continent that guide those investigations, that know the topics, that are affected by the topics they're writing about. So malaria would be an example for a journal which does a good job at this. They're focusing much more on collaborative efforts rather than just pushing Western authors. We can also look at the numbers for journals like this. If we accumulate those numbers we had earlier, the percentage of zero Africa affiliated papers versus the journal ranking, we see a general trend. The higher ranked our journal is, it appears the more likely it is to feature a high percentage of publications that feature no Africans. So and that also is problematic because that sort of reserves the highest ranked journals for only the Westerners, for only the Western institutions. Similarly, if we have a look at the average Africa-related authorship per paper, so this was just the 0 African author papers. That's what we see there. Same trend. So if we increase the ranking, we get fewer and fewer African authors by publication. So if we're going from the medium ranked ones, we have around 30 to 40% on average, and we're slowly dropping down. And if we're going to the top journals, they feature less than 20%, 10%, somewhere in that area. And the troubling thing is, we have recorded that over time. So remember, we have data from the 1960s. So we can accumulate all this data by the decade and look at how it has changed, how the percentages, how the frequency of African authors on those publications has changed by decade. If we look from the 1960s up until now, the percentage of Africa-affiliated authors has only increased from 35 to roughly 40% from the 1960s. At least the 0 African author publications, they have dropped somewhat. So maybe there's a bit more awareness now than it was in the 60s. But along with this, also the average journal ranking of those publications has dropped as well. So the publications appear in lower ranked journals now than they did in the 60s, with a decreasing trend. Which looks like that research is relegated to a lower place, is it? Finally, I want to have a look at the geographic location and distribution of the frequencies. So, that's a map of Africa, and we have listed the average journal ranking of publications from their country or concerning this country on this heat map. So in red, we have a very low average journal ranking. So meaning the publications on average appear in lower ranked journals. If we're moving on to yellow and then to green, we have a higher average ranking for the publications. So meaning if you pick a publication from one of the green countries, you're more likely that it has appeared in a high-ranked journal, in a well-regarded journal. And this gets really interesting if we link that with the map for the authorship. So this time the colors mean the percentage of no local authors. So meaning when we have a low number, that means we have almost no publications where we don't have any locals attached. The red colors means most of the publications have no local authors attached. So if we look how they coincide, we're looking at the Democratic Republic of Congo, for example. So you have a fairly decent journal ranking, but why is that? No African authors attached. That again, all these things, they're very worrying discoveries. And we can put this in numbers. So we're going to do the same thing we've been doing here. If we compare the two maps together, we're going to compare those numbers together. So this is a scatter plot of, on the x-axis, we have the total research population, meaning how many researchers do we have in the country. On the y-axis, the percentage of the local authors in their publications. And we can see, for countries, so in black we have the countries in Africa, in green we have countries from Latin America, blue is Europe, and red is Southeast Asia. And even with similar research populations, we have a pretty high variance. And for countries like Albania and Bosnia in Europe, even though they have very few researchers, they manage to own almost all of the research they're conducting. They almost have no exclusively outsider papers written about topics concerning them. We can do this for several other metrics. So this was the research population in total, but that might not account for the size of countries' populations. So obviously, if you have a huge country with a huge population, you're going to have more researchers, or you would expect more researchers. So we have the same plot here with the researchers per million population, because we have to scale for a country's population size. And again, we're seeing the same things. Albania, for example, from Europe, it doesn't have that high of a researcher per capita count, but still, they own most of their own research. Same in Cambodia and Myanmar. They're among the 5 lowest countries. They have one of the 5 lowest researchers per capita counts, much lower than many of the African countries. So you could make the argument, yeah, if there's not that many researchers, it's harder to engage with foreign authors. Fair point. If there's not many researchers to communicate, to collaborate with, maybe it's more likely to see collaborations which don't feature, you see publications which don't feature any collaboration. But it doesn't seem to keep Cambodia, Myanmar, Albania from achieving that. Moving on, we have several more factors. Next is the research spending percentage. So the percentage of a country's GDP that goes into research and development. Because again, you could argue maybe it is the quality of the research is directly correlated to the amount of money that goes into the research sector. But once again, on the x-axis is this figure, so the percentage of the GDP that goes into research. Albania, Bosnia from Europe, they don't spend a lot of their income on research and development. So, and still, you see them owning almost all of their research. Same goes for Cambodia and Myanmar, Southeast Asian countries. Same here. Same argument holds. Maybe it's correlated to the country's GDP. So maybe the European countries, they're doing better because they have a higher total income. They have a higher total amount of money they can spend on research. But again, that's the total number of spending. So millions of US dollars. Not just as a fraction of their income, but the total amount of money they have. And we see the same picture. Again, the European countries, they're doing massively better than the African or the Asian or the American countries with the same amount of money for their research. So with all these things, they're all based on arguments we have heard to justify why do we see those low numbers of African authors on those papers. They're always almost without fail being put forth by Western researchers to justify what is happening there. But if we check them with other countries outside Africa, this does not appear to be the case. What we can see is, if we link, again, on the y-axis, the percentage of local author, of zero local author publications against the HDI, the Human Development Index. That's the first time we can see a somewhat solid correlation. There we see what's happening. There we see how X influences Y. So with a high HDI, all of a sudden you're much more likely to own most of your own research. But that begs the question, if we have the same research spending, the same amount of researchers, and that didn't seem to influence our local author percentage, why does the HDI? Does that really give you a better environment to produce research? Or is it a matter of perception? Are those countries with a higher HEI perceived to produce better research, or is it actually the case? Those are questions we cannot get answered purely based on the data and on the research we have done so far. That needs further investigation. We need to figure out new methods how to assess that and how to include the African authors. So that means the African research, all of you. We need to have some feedback from you. Why do you think that is? Where do the problems lie? How can they be solved? What could be done better to steer away from those low African author percentages in those publications? So I give the floor back to Sarah-Lise. He's going to talk a little bit more about what we have planned for further research, where we see the problems, what our conclusions are. Thank you very much.
Doing okay? Yes. Just be patient to listen to my part, then you can leave. I'm going to wrap up with some conclusions and future work. So the conclusions are what Martin has said is that he has given you a picture of the frequency of African authors in publications that directly affect Africa, right? And he has also explained to you how this frequency is related to factors like country, journal, impact factors, and so on. So if you look at this picture, I mean, this is a cycle that we need to break. The reputation is important, I mean, especially in the Western world. If you have a high reputation, you are likely to get funding. And if you get funding, you are likely to make impact, right? So this is it's a vicious cycle. I mean, they do this by publishing papers in very high journals, or very high impact journals, with little or no authors from Africa. So that they maintain their reputation, and they get funding, using their reputation, and they make what they claim to make impact, right? And what you guys, the African scientists, or the future African scientists, what we need to do is to break this cycle, right? Now this is a news that came out in BBC a few days ago, right? This is about about human fossils. Everybody knows that humans came from Africa, and there's a lot of research being done going back to many years about how or which part of Africa the humans came from, right? And most of this research, once again, is being done by Westerners, right? There are scientists, yes, in Africa working on this stuff, but their names are not well recognized in the world because they don't have the funds. That's what this professor highly says. He's actually an Ethiopian. He's an Ethiopian professor. He has, through hard work, he has made some research in this area and made a name for himself. But he's like 1 in a million. He's like 1 in a million out of the African researchers working in this area. The most of the research being done about human origin in Africa is being done by the Western scientists, right? It's being done by the Western scientists. And there are little or no authors. And people like this professor from Ethiopia are maybe 1 in 1,000 or 1 in a million, right? So what are the possible solutions? The one possible solution is to obviously African researchers need to be better included in their rest of the research fields. And the funds the funds for, there are little funds. I mean, I talked to Dr. Florence yesterday. There are little funds in Africa to do things. I mean, the funds from the funds that the Western scientists have need to be shared by the scientists in Africa, right? So that they can work together on a problem in Africa that affects Africa, right? And also the third point is that the researchers in foreign institutes need to be aware about the inequalities that Martin explained. That is, inequalities with respect to having very few authors from Africa in papers affecting Africa, right? These are some future work that we plan to do, right? We plan to do a further citation analysis, and we also plan to develop an assessment strategy of author qualification based on experts' opinion of African authors. That, I think the second point I already mentioned it earlier in my part, that is, when there are researchers from the West working on a problem related to Africa, their qualifications need to be assessed by experts from Africa to see whether they are qualified to work on a problem related to Africa. They have the right knowledge, right, before writing a paper, right? Okay, so that's some future work. And any feedback that you guys, I know you guys, I really appreciate, Martin and I really appreciate that so many of you have come. Any feedback that you can give us by email or by right now would be much appreciated. But my email address, Martin's email address is this one and this one, right? And because
should we open for more questions?
yeah, any questions you guys have or feedback, please let us know, right?
Yes, please.
Have there been equivalent studies in other continental areas? Because obviously you chose to look at Africa as one big block.
Yes.
So have there also been other equivalent studies, let's say, for Asia or for South America, as opposed to, because I saw that part of the comparison was a mixture of continental and country science.
Yeah. So at the moment, from other researchers, we don't have any published studies regarding this, regardless of continent. With our own research, we've done it for Africa for now. We were looking at those other continents to have something to compare it to, so we can further investigate. Is that a specifically African issue? Or is that in every continent? Do we get similar numbers if we're looking at Asia or at South America, for example? There, we have only done it for a couple of countries there to have this comparison. We haven't done it for all the continents yet. That might be something to look into, but gathering the data is a bit laborious.
And then probably my follow-up question is there any correlation between the former colonial master of any African country vis-a-vis the research which is being done, albeit excluding the Africans?
Right. We haven't investigated that yet, but it's a very good point. So since we have accumulated the data by country, we can look into this. So we can take all the former colonies and check whether their percentages significantly differ from the ones that haven't been colonized, or if there are differences between, let's say, former British or former French colonies. That's a very good point. That's something I believe we will look into in the future.
Yes, sir. Yes.
Thank you for your presentation. It's quite emotional. your figures are speaking for themselves, and you don't have to we actually notice that these things are real. But we also include things like correlation with behavior, especially because most of the areas that we're looking sub-Saharan land, behavioral analysis, and things like infrastructural, the infrastructure. Because one thing this is just a feeling, it's not an academic observation. If you look at an average, I speak for what I know. Things like the infrastructure, you look at the way things are set up, where you find that a researcher, just take a day in the life of an African researcher. You have got a person with children. They are looking at the schools in the west, the wife works in the south, the transport network, you take maybe 2 hours to go there. So you can hardly find a researcher maybe spending 24 hours or more than 8 hours. Things like that. I don't know how you can call it. Then the issue of behavior as well, where just like that behavior from these big countries, generally different, the way the culture and also even going back into change.
Thank you, sir, for that question. I know the infrastructure is a problem in Africa. I know they have. Obviously the standards in the West are much better. That doesn't mean, that's not an excuse for scientists in the West not to collaborate with scientists in Africa. That's not they have grants, they have funds. They can use part of the fund to provide better infrastructure, better conditions for research in Africa, and work with the scientists in Africa to write these papers, right?
If I may add on this.
Yeah.
So this is what we described as this vicious circle. Because the lack of funds is very evident, and that leads, as you said, to a lot of hardship. It's very troublesome to focus on research for local researchers. But this just keeps propagating itself. And there's very little being done by the West at the moment to help out with this situation. So as this news article for the archaeological dig showed, very often people in the West, they get a grant to finance a dig. So they bring their team from the West, dig up the fossils, do the investigation, pack up, go back, and then they write a paper without any local authors attached. And that is exactly this problematic behavior we're criticizing. That is what needs changing in our perception.
Do we really need the West to inform the African side? Or they should write something themselves? I think we are also to blame ourselves, actually. And it's not more research that is expensive.
Yeah.
I'll give you a simple example of witchcraft. You don't need a lot of money.
I heard stories like, I have written to many scientists in the African continent, including Zimbabwe. I heard stories saying that people from outside the continent come to certain countries in Africa and they collect the data and then disappear, never to be seen again. So that means they don't want to work with anyone here. They just want the data and go back to their own countries and write their papers. You know what I'm saying? They don't want to. Yeah. Yes, sir.
I take it that the latter part of your presentation was referring to solutions as to the matter at hand. So my question I want to pose to you is, if it is a solution to the current situation that we're suffering right now, what is the benefit the West has to Africa as in collaborating with Africans to initiate productiveness between Africans and the West themselves? Do they benefit much? So if it's a solution to the current state of affairs, you're just probing you're just suggesting solutions which aren't really feasible. Because I'm looking at a situation where the West is collecting data from Africa. They're benefiting from that, and I realize that. But then if we want to solve a solution, we want to solve a problem by looking at the cons that are there by a certain solution that's being done by another country, is there much benefit, or should we look for something from an internal point of view? If we want to correct something that's internal by using external means, I think it's a matter of concern that we should look more to them, what they benefit more. Then if we're looking at our internal problems, it's much better and much productive if we fix it internally than to look outside the box. So I don't know, is that solution very feasible, or is it just a suggestion?
Right. I mean, what we're saying is not that Africa can only overcome those challenges with outside help. That's not what we're saying. The thing is, there's research being done, and their reputations being garnered on those results. And there's little being done to collaborate with the people that are there. So there might not, as you say, that's absolutely correct. There might be situations where the collaboration might not be necessary or might not greatly benefit something. But in a lot of situations, it does. So we can't say generally, we have to go by case-by-case basis, and also on the field, where maybe some things are more closely tied to the local circumstances. If you're doing pure math, for example, that's going to be the same in Africa or in England. That's all the same. But if you're talking about local issues, then you should involve local people in the discussion. I mean, because our perception is we have to get away from this thinking of talking about Africa rather than having an actual conversation and communication.
Yeah. I mean, as Martin said, it's the question about, I think it's a question of the scientists in the West, they can learn by talking to people in the continent. I think it's too arrogant to say that, I know everything about the continent, so I don't need to contact anybody in the continent, and I can write the paper myself without anybody in the continent. That's too arrogant. I think that there should be a sense of responsibility or social responsibility to the continent, so that you should at least give a hand to the people and say that, and work with them and try to learn from them before writing their papers. You know what I'm saying? Yeah. I think, like what Martin said, like in certain journals like Science and Nature, he showed the pie chart. I think you guys looked at the pie chart. More than 70% of the papers in Science and Nature have no authors from Africa. And those are the two top journals in the world. The Science and Nature are the highest impact factor journals in the world. And if you publish 2 or 3 papers, that's enough to get you to professor. Because level. And they do that. The people in the West, they do that easily, and they're not bothered about, they have no sense of social responsibility, right? All they are concerned with is about their own welfare, to get themselves promoted, get more salary, buy a bigger house, or even get a better wife maybe.
I think, Professor Lee?
Maybe something you should know is that trying to publish in some of these journals is not that easy also. You can write a paper unless you are writing with someone who has already published in it. Your write-up won't be published in that journal. It's very difficult to actually penetrate in that, except if you know somebody. That's when you get a publication. For example, in these wine series journals, if you do not know anyone, it's very, very difficult. We have managed to publish maybe some Elsevier journals and maybe Springer for different reasons, because maybe we were connected to other people. But alone, if you send your paper, sometimes it just doesn't go.
Yeah. But thank you very much. I think that ties into what we're trying to say here. Because if we have a percentage of 80-90% foreigners, and 89% of the authors, they're located in Europe or in the US, then it's, as you said, if you have to know somebody to get into this elite little club, well, and if there's no collaboration between outside countries and Africa, that makes it indefinitely harder for African authors to gain access to these publications, doesn't it? So that's one of the reasons why we think there should be a larger collaboration, a bigger collaborative effort.
Martin is right. I mean, the collaboration should come from the West to Africa rather than the other way around. You know what I'm saying? But the people there are not bothered. They are not bothered to collaborate with people, with the African experts here. I mean, their main thing is not their business. But it is. I mean, it is a question of social responsibility. You know, it is a question of social responsibility, because if you are using data, if you're using some data from Africa, then you should make sure that the data is correct and the factors concerning the data are accurate. Okay. So it would be at least fair, at least to contact somebody in Africa before you write the papers.
I personally think that we don't have to pin it all on the Western countries, because most African researchers or scientists, right, once they finish their degrees, right, they go to the West, they get a good job and a good salary, right? So, but they are blinded by those good salary, right, and they relax on the research. So someone got to step up and do the research. I think so. So the Europeans, they now get the chance to do the research, while the Africans, they just enjoy
Yeah, it poses another challenge. Yeah, yes, please.
Okay, I would like to ask you, is there like a specific board that looks into the reanalyzation of journals that have been written by the Western, to see if, are they writing what they are writing, and is it actually feasible to write that kind of stuff for Africans, or they are not doing a great job themselves to analyze the journals?
Well, I'm sure most journals, they should have like an ethical committee that would look into something like this, but it's also a question of how good a job are they doing, or how problematic do they see this behavior?
The board, like the African committee, exists to analyze the journals.
Is that a thing?
No, there is no such thing at the moment. There is no such thing. But what we propose in this talk is to have a committee of African experts to assess if the authors are qualified to write on that area. I think it's something we want to suggest in the future.
So what about the Western, which we have African affiliations? What are they able to analyze it themselves? Like Westerns, which we have African affiliations.
Yes, the main incident, main incident is.
Okay, so if I'm
saying, let's say this, the African community does it, but we do have Westerns, our Western authors or Western people who know things about Africa, who have knowledge about Africa, and who have been in Africa. So are they able to analyze those things to to see that what the authors are writing is basically
Right.
African.
Yeah, no, absolutely correct. That is what we said in the beginning. That's one of the shortcomings of analyzing things this way. Because obviously you could have a person from Africa, as your colleague said it, if they go to the West, they would obviously still have a very good understanding of the dynamics of their home country. But it wouldn't appear as an affiliated author, right? So this is a proxy, this is an approximation to what is going on, an indication of what is happening. To accurately assess that, you would have to go through every author's background, where have they been, where they come from, did they do extensive stays abroad to assess each individual author. That's what I'm saying, you could maybe do this with a panel like that, or that you would have a committee checking people's CVs, their academic career, if they can have these qualifications, this very intricate knowledge. But we're saying if you have no collaborators that are currently there, that sort of speaks for the fact that the collaboration isn't happening, the actual communication isn't happening. So if you're closely tied to a research institution in Africa, why would you have 0 authors with an affiliation there currently? I mean, there are going to be publications that slip through the cracks, where maybe it's 3 African authors in Britain and the US or whatever, so we would not recognize it this way. And we realize that's a shortcoming of the study, and that's something we want to improve. We need to change our algorithm to more accurately assess people's backgrounds, people's affiliations, people's qualifications. That's absolutely correct point. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Saradis. Thank you, Martin, for the insightful presentation. Thank you, members of staff, students, for sparing your time attending this presentation. We are at the end of our presentation, but I am urging staff members here present to remain behind for a photo shoot. Okay, good day.